The challenge that lasted only 7 seconds, the sun had already begun to fade behind the hills of Los Angeles, leaving the sky painted in shades of amber and deep purple. Hollywood Boulevard was unusually calm that evening, though inside one of the most famous restaurants in the city, the air was alive with laughter, music, and the familiar glow of celebrity presence. Inside the softly lit room, a small jazz band played in the corner. The sound of a piano drifted across the tables like a warm breeze. At a quiet table near the back sat a man who seemed perfectly comfortable with silence. That man was Dean Martin. Dean leaned back in his chair, a half-finished glass of sparkling water sitting beside him. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, as if the entire world outside the restaurant had slowed down to match his pace. To most people, Dean Martin was more than a singer or actor. He was an era. His voice had carried millions through heartbreak, laughter, and late-night loneliness. But those who knew him personally understood something deeper about him, something quieter. Dean had a gift, not the gift of performance, the gift of presence. He had the rare ability to make any room feel lighter simply by being there. Across the restaurant, the door opened, a tall man stepped inside. The room shifted. Slightly, people turned their heads. The man walking in carried himself with a quiet intensity. It's like someone who was used to commanding attention without asking for it. It was Steven Seagal. At that time, Steven Seagal had already built a reputation for being one of Hollywood's most confident martial artists. His movies had shown audiences a different kind of action hero, one who moved with precision, calmness, and explosive speed. But tonight, he wasn't here for a movie, he was here for dinner. Behind him entered another man whose presence could fill an entire room without a single word. Broad shoulders, slow, steady steps. A face that had become legendary in American cinema. John Wayne, the Duke himself. Wayne walked beside Seagal like a towering shadow of old Hollywood strength. Though he was known for his Western roles and rugged characters, those who met him often discovered something unexpected, thoughtful and observant. Personality. The three men represented three very different generations of Hollywood, and fate had placed them all in the same room. Steven noticed Dean first. He paused slightly. Glancing toward the back of the restaurant, Dean Martin raised his glass slightly in greeting. John Wayne chuckled quietly. "Well," Wayne said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder, "looks like we just walked into a story." Steven smiled faintly. The three men soon found themselves sitting together at the same table. The conversation started lightly, stories from film sets, memories of performances, moments from decades of Hollywood history. The jazz band continued playing softly as waiters moved between tables carrying plates of food and glasses of wine, but eventually, the conversation drifted toward something unexpected. Martial arts. Steven leaned forward slightly. "You know," said his voice calm but confident, "people misunderstand what martial arts really are." Dean raised an eyebrow with a playful smile. "Oh yeah?" he replied. Steven nodded. "It's not about fighting. It's about discipline, timing, control." John Wayne nodded slowly. "That sounds a lot like acting," he said. Steven smiled. "In a way it is." Dean rested his elbow on the table, amused. "So, what you're saying is," Dean said, "if someone stood against you, they'd have about, 5 minutes?" Steven chuckled softly. 5 minutes would be generous." Wayne leaned back in his chair. "Then how long would it really take?" Steven paused. He looked directly at Dean Martin. His tone was calm. 30 seconds. The table grew quiet. Steven continued. "If someone could stand against me for 30 seconds, I'd call them master." Dean stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed, not loudly, but the kind of laugh that made everyone else smile too. 30 seconds, huh?" Dean said. Steven nodded. Dean tilted his head slightly. "What if someone only lasted 7? Steven smirked. "Then they probably shouldn't have stood up." John Wayne shook his head with a grin. "You boys are about to start something." Dean slowly placed his glass on the table. He stood. Not aggressively, not challengingly, just casually. The restaurant quieted. Slightly as nearby tables noticed the movement, Dean stretched his shoulders lightly. "All right," he said. Steven watched him carefully. Dean continued. "Let's say I give it a try." The room grew still. Steven rose from his chair. His posture immediately changed. The relaxed man who had been eating dinner moments earlier now moved with focused control. He stepped away from the table. Dean followed. John Wayne stayed seated, watching. With amused curiosity, "Gentlemen," Wayne said calmly, "try not to break the furniture." A small open space formed between the tables. Restaurant guests watched quietly. Steven raised his hands, slightly not in aggression, but in readiness. Dean simply stood there, relaxed, unbesored. Steven spoke calmly. 30 seconds. Dean nodded. The jazz band had stopped playing. The restaurant was silent. A waiter froze mid-step. Someone quietly whispered near the bar. Steven moved first, faster than most people in the room expected. But before the motion even fully unfolded, something happened. Something so subtle that many people didn't even understand what they had just seen. 7 seconds, that was all it took. Steven stopped moving. His expression changed. He lowered his hands. The room remained silent. Dean hadn't attacked. He hadn't moved aggressively, but somehow, Steven stepped back. He looked at Dean with a completely different expression now, not competitive, respectful. Steven exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. Dean waited. Steven nodded slightly. "I guess that makes you the master?" The restaurant erupted into laughter and applause. John Wayne stood up slowly, shaking his head. "I knew it," Wayne said with a grin. Dean simply shrugged and picked up his glass again. "What can I say?" he replied casually. "I got lucky in 7 seconds." But John Wayne knew something everyone else had just begun to realize. That moment hadn't been about martial arts. It hadn't been about strength. It had been about something far more powerful. Something Steven Seagal himself had recognized in that. Instant confidence, calmness, and the quiet power of a man who never needed to prove anything. As the band slowly started playing again and dinner resumed, John Wayne leaned toward Dean and said quietly, "Kid, you didn't win that because of speed." Dean raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" Wayne smiled. "Because you understood something most fighters never do." Dean waited. Wayne leaned back in his chair. "The real fight is over before it begins." Dean chuckled softly, and somewhere across the restaurant, Steven Seagal was still thinking about those 7 seconds, because what had happened in that moment, had just taught him something he had never learned in decades of training. The restaurant slowly returned to life. The jazz band resumed its melody. Plates clinked softly against tables, and quiet conversations returned to the room. Yet the atmosphere had changed. People were still whispering about what they had just witnessed. 7 seconds. No shouting, no fight, no dramatic move. And yet something powerful had happened in that brief moment at the table. Dean Martin, John Wayne, Steven Seagal sat again, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Dean took a slow sip of his drink. Steven leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a confident martial artist, and more like a student reflecting on a lesson. John Wayne watched him carefully. The Duke had spent a lifetime observing people. He had played heroes, soldiers, cowboys, and leaders on screen. But the reason he portrayed those characters so convincingly was because he understood something about human nature. He understood pride, and he understood humility. Steven finally spoke. "Dean," he said quietly, "you didn't even move." Dean shrugged lightly. "Sometimes moving is the wrong move." Steven studied him for a moment. "Then what happened?" Dean smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, John Wayne leaned forward, resting his large hands on the table. "You really want to know?" Wayne asked. Steven nodded. Wayne's deep voice lowered slightly. It's like a storyteller preparing to reveal something important. What happened out there wasn't a fight, Wayne said. It was a test. Steven frowned slightly. A test. Wayne nodded. Double quotes. Yes. Dean chuckled quietly. Careful, Duke. He said, you're about to make me sound smarter than I am. Wayne ignored the comment. Kid Wayne continued looking. At Steven, you walked into that moment believing strength would decide the outcome. Steven didn't argue. Wayne continued. But Dean walked into it knowing something you didn't. Steven leaned forward slightly, and what was that? Wayne smiled. That the most powerful position in any confrontation is calm. The word yeah lingered in the air. Calm. Steven considered it. I was calm, he replied. Wayne shook his head slowly. No, he said. You were focused. That's not the same thing. Dean watched the conversation quietly, enjoying the moment. Wayne continued. Focus means you're thinking about winning. Calm means you already know the outcome. Stefan remained silent. Dean finally spoke. You ever notice something about people who start fights? He asked. Steven looked at him. They always need the other person to react. Steven nodded slowly. Dean continued. If the other person doesn't react, the fight falls apart. Wayne smiled slightly. Exactly. Steven leaned back, replaying the moment in his mind when he had stepped forward, when he had moved quickly, when Dean had simply stood there, relaxed. Steven suddenly realized something. You weren't trying to defend yourself, he said. Dean shook his head. Nope. Steven frowned. Then what were you doing? Dean smiled, watching. Wayne chuckled. Dean wasn't watching your hands, Wayne said. Steven looked confused. Then what? Wayne tapped the table. He was watching your confidence. Steven blinked. My confidence. Wayne nodded. You walked in believing you were about to prove something. Steven didn't deny it. Wayne continued. And the moment someone believes they have to prove something, he paused. They've already lost half the battle. The words hit deeper than Steven expected. Dean raised his glass slightly. Duke always did enjoy speeches. Wayne ignored him again. Kid Wayne said, strength is impressive, but composure? He paused. Composure makes people rethink their strength. Steven exhaled slowly. For the first time that night, he smiled in a different way. Not the confident smile of someone who believed they were the best in the room, but the respectful smile of someone who had just learned something valuable. You two planned that, didn't you? Steven said. Dean laughed. No. Wayne grinned. But we might start charging for it. The tension finally broke, and the table relaxed again. Dinner continued. Stories flowed. But Steven remained thoughtful. Eventually, the night grew late. The restaurant began to empty. The jazz band packed up their instruments. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the streets of Los Angeles. Steven stood first. He extended his hand to Dean. Dean shook it warmly. No hard feelings. Steven asked. Dean smiled. None at all. Steven then turned to John Wayne. Wayne stood and shook his hand firmly. You'll do fine, kid, Wayne said. Steven tilted his head slightly. What makes you say that? Wayne answered simply. Because the ones who learn become stronger than the ones who only win. Steven nodded slowly. He looked back at Dean one more time. You know, he said, I meant what I said earlier. Dean raised an eyebrow. If someone could stand against me for 30 seconds? Steven smiled. I'd call them master. Paused. Looks like I only needed 7. Dean laughed quietly. 7 seconds can teach a lot. Steven walked toward the exit. But just before reaching the door, he stopped. He turned back toward their table. One more question, he said. Dean looked up. What is it? Steven asked. How did you know I would stop? Dean leaned back in his chair. His answer was simple. Because the moment someone realizes they're fighting the wrong kind of battle, he smiled gently. They usually choose wisdom. Steven nodded. Then he stepped outside into the cool night. The door closed behind him. Inside the restaurant, John Wayne slowly stood and placed on his hat. "You know something, Dean?" Wayne said. Dean looked at him. Wayne smiled. That might have been the shortest lesson in Hollywood history. Dean chuckled. 7 seconds, he said. Wayne nodded, and one man walking away wiser than he walked in. They stepped outside together. The city lights stretched across the horizon and somewhere down the street. Steven Seagal was still thinking about what had happened, because sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones that happen in a fight. They're the ones that happen inside a person's understanding. The story John Wayne never told, the night air outside the restaurant carried a quiet chill. Los Angeles never truly slept. But in the late hours, it slowed down enough that the city felt almost thoughtful. The glow of streetlights stretched across the pavement, and distant traffic hummed softly like background music. Dean Martin and John Wayne stepped out of the restaurant together. The door closed behind them with a gentle click. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dean placed his hands in his coat pockets and looked up toward the sky. "You ever notice something about nights like this?" he said quietly. Wayne adjusted his hat. "What's that?" Dean shrugged. "They make people think more than they usually do." Wayne chuckled lightly. "That's because there are fewer distractions." They began walking slowly down the sidewalk. Inside, the restaurant. The lights dimmed as the staff prepared to close. But something about the evening lingered, not because of what had happened between Dean Martin and Steven Seagal, but because of the lesson behind it. Wayne stopped walking. Dean noticed. "What's on your mind, Duke?" Wayne leaned against a nearby street lamp for a moment. The legendary actor didn't look like the confident Western hero audiences knew. He looked older, thoughtful, like a man remembering something he had carried for years. "You know," Wayne said slowly, "that kid tonight reminded me of someone." Dean tilted his head. "Who?" Wayne looked down the quiet street. "Me." Dean raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's unexpected." Wayne chuckled softly. "Not as unexpected as you'd think." Dean waited. Wayne rarely told personal stories unless they mattered, and when he did, they usually carried a lesson. Wayne crossed his arms and began speaking. "Years ago," he said, "long before I became the John Wayne people know, I thought toughness meant never backing down." Dean nodded slowly. "That sounds about right for a young actor trying to survive Hollywood." Wayne smirked. "You have no idea?" He continued. "There was a man I met during one of my early film shoots." Dean listened carefully. Wayne's voice softened slightly as the memory came back to him. He wasn't famous, not an actor, not a fighter. Just an older man who worked behind the scenes. Dean asked quietly, "What did he do?" Wayne shrugged. "A little bit of everything, set repairs, equipment, odd jobs." Dean nodded. "So what made him memorable?" Wayne smiled faintly. "One afternoon I watched him handle something most men wouldn't know how to handle." Dean leaned against a nearby railing. Listening, Wayne continued. "There were 2 stuntmen arguing on set. Loud, angry, getting closer to throwing punches. Dean could picture it easily. Film sets could become tense places." Wayne went on. "I walked over because I figured someone had to break it up. But before I could say anything," Wayne paused. "That old man stepped between them." Dean asked. "And—" Wayne chuckled. "And nothing." Dean frowned. "Nothing." Wayne nodded. "He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't push anyone." Dean looked confused. "So what did he do?" Wayne smiled slowly. "He stood there." Dean blinked. "That was it." Wayne nodded. "That was it." Dean shook his head. "Now, you're messing with me." Wayne laughed. "I thought the same thing." Something strange happened. Dean waited. Wayne continued. The 2 stuntmen suddenly got quiet. They stopped yelling. After about 10 seconds, they both walked away. Dean thought about it. What made them stop? Answered calmly. "The same thing that stopped Steven tonight." Dean understood immediately. Presence. Wayne continued. "Afterward, I asked the old man how he did it." Dean asked, "What did he say?" Wayne's voice dropped slightly as he repeated the words. He said, "People only fight when they believe someone else wants to fight back." Dean smiled. Wayne continued, but then he said something else. Dean looked curious. What? Wayne replied, the strongest man in the room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it. The street grew quiet again. Dean looked thoughtful. You remembered that all these years? Wayne nodded, never forgot it. Dean smirked. Sounds like the old guy taught you something important. Wayne looked at him. Yeah. Dean waited. Wayne finished quietly. He taught me what real strength looks like. A soft wind passed through the street, somewhere down the road. A car drove by slowly. Dean chuckled. Well, he said, looks like you passed the lesson along tonight. Wayne shook his head. No. Dean frowned. No. Wayne smiled. Dean did. Dean laughed. Oh, come on. Wayne pointed at him. You stood there tonight the same way that old man did? Dean shrugged. I was just being myself. Wayne nodded. That's exactly the point. For a moment they both stood in silence again. Then Wayne looked down the street. You think Steven understood the lesson? Dean smiled. Oh yeah, Wayne asked. How can you tell?
Ow.
Dean answered calmly. Because he walked away thinking instead of talking. Wayne laughed. Fair enough. But just as they were about to continue walking, a voice came from behind them. Dean. Both men turned. Steven Seagal was standing a few steps away. He must have come back quietly. Dean smiled. Forgot something. Steven shook his head. No, he looked serious. I realized something. Wayne folded his arms. What's that? Steven looked directly at Dean. I've trained for decades. Dean nodded. Steven continued. But tonight, learned something in 7 seconds that training never taught me. Dean raised an eyebrow. And what was that? Steven smiled slightly. That the most dangerous opponent, he paused, is the one who isn't trying to defeat you. 3 men stood there quietly. Wayne tipped his hat slightly. Now you're getting it. Steven looked toward the quiet street and something else. Dean asked. What? Steven replied. I think that lesson might take a lifetime to master. Dean laughed softly. Good thing you've got time. Steven nodded. Then he turned and walked away again. This time without looking back. Wayne watched him go. Well, he said. Dean waited. Wayne finished with a grin. Looks like tonight turned into a master class. Dean smirked. 7 seconds. Wayne laughed. 7 seconds? That might change a man's life. And neither of them realized yet that something even more meaningful would happen the next morning. Something that would reveal why that moment mattered far more than anyone understood. The 7 seconds that became a lifetime lesson morning arrived slowly over Los Angeles, the city that had glowed with lights. The night before now woke under a pale golden sunrise. Traffic began to fill the streets again. Cafes opened their doors, and newspapers landed on front porches across the city. But for Dean Martin, the morning felt unusually quiet. He sat alone on the balcony of his home, a cup of coffee in his hand. The sunlight stretched across the hills in the distance. But Dean wasn't looking at the view. He was thinking. Not about the restaurant, not about the applause, not even about the moment that had lasted only 7 seconds. He was thinking about something much older, a memory, one he rarely spoke about. Inside the house, telephone rang. Dean didn't move at first. It rang again. Finally, he stood up and walked inside, picking up the receiver. Hello? The voice on the other end was familiar. Morning, Dean. It was John Wayne. Dean smiled slightly. Morning, Duke. Wayne's deep voice carried its usual calm strength. You see the news yet? Dean frowned slightly. What news? Chuckled. Well, apparently half of Hollywood heard about last night. Dean sighed. That figures. Wayne continued. They're saying Dean Martin defeated a martial arts master without throwing a punch. Dean laughed quietly. That's a pretty dramatic way to tell the story, Wayne replied calmly. People like dramatic stories. Dean leaned against the kitchen counter. That's because most people misunderstand what actually happened. Wayne was silent for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. Why did you really do it, Dean? Dean didn't answer immediately. He knew what Wayne meant. Not the moment in the restaurant, the reason behind it. Wayne spoke again. I know you better than most people. You didn't stand up just to prove something. Dean looked toward the window outside. The city continued waking up. Finally, he spoke. You remember my father? Wayne nodded on the other end of the phone. Of course. Dean's voice softened. When I was a kid, my father used to tell me something. Wayne waited. Dean continued. He said the world is full of men who want to show how strong they are. Wayne said quietly. That sounds about right, Dean continued. But he also said something else. Wayne asked. What? Dean repeated. The words slowly. The strongest man in the room is usually the one who doesn't need anyone to know it. Wayne smiled slightly. That sounds familiar. Dean chuckled. Funny how the same lessons show up again and again. Wayne replied, that's because they're usually true. Dean walked back to the balcony and sat down again. The morning air felt calm. Last night, Dean said, I didn't stand up to challenge Steven. Wayne asked. Then why did you stand? Dean answered simply. To show him something. Wayne already knew, but he asked anyway. Dean replied that strength isn't always about speed, or technique, or winning. Wayne nodded slowly, and did he understand? Dean smiled. Oh yeah. But something unexpected happened that afternoon. Around noon, Dean received another phone call. This time was Steven Seagal. Dean answered. Hello? Steven's voice sounded thoughtful. Dean, I hope I'm not bothering you. Dean chuckled. Not at all. Steven paused. I wanted to thank you. Dean raised an eyebrow. For what? Steven replied. For last night. Dean laughed. You're thanking me for embarrassing you in front of a restaurant full of people? Steven shook his head, though Dean couldn't see it. You didn't embarrass me? He paused. You helped me understand something. Dean listened. Steven continued. You know, I've spent most of my life learning how to win fights, Dean said quietly. And? Steven answered slowly. But last night I realized something. Dean waited. Steven finished the sentence. I've spent very little time learning how to avoid them. Words hung in the air. Dean smiled. Well, he said gently, that realization alone puts you ahead of most people. Steven continued. I've replayed that moment 100 times in my head, Dean asked. And what did you figure out? Steven said quietly. You didn't defeat me. Dean waited. Steven finished. You defeated the idea that I needed to win. Dean leaned back in his chair. That's a powerful realization, Steven continued. You know what the strangest part is? Dean asked. What? Steven replied. I don't feel like I lost. Dean laughed. That's because you didn't. Steven paused. Then what happened? Dean answered calmly. You learned something. Steven exhaled slowly, and I think that lesson might stay with me forever. Dean smiled. I hope it does. Before hanging up, Steven said one more thing. You told me 7 seconds can teach a lot. Dean nodded. Steven finished quietly. Think those 7 seconds just changed the way I look at the rest of my life. The call ended. Dean sat quietly again on the balcony. The city was now fully awake. Cars passed below. People hurried through their day. But somewhere in the distance, a man who had trained his entire life to fight had just discovered something far more valuable. Understanding later that evening. John Wayne visited Dean again. They sat together watching the sunset. Wayne looked at him and asked one final question. You ever think about how strange it is? Dean looked at him. What? Wayne smiled. That the most important moment of the night? He paused. Lasted only 7 seconds. Dean laughed softly. Well, he said, sometimes the shortest moments teach the biggest lessons. Wayne nodded. Double quotes, and sometimes those lessons travel farther than we ever expect. Dean looked out toward the horizon. He thought about Steven. He thought about the conversation. And he thought about the lesson his father had given him long ago. Then he said quietly, You know what the real victory was last night? Wayne asked. What? Dean answered, That nobody had to lose. The sun slowly disappeared behind the hills, and somewhere in the city, a man who once believed strength meant winning fights had begun learning that the greatest strength in the world is knowing when. You don't need to fight at all.